Excuse me, you guys. The host is muted, so I can see really well, but I can't hear a thing. The mute sign is still on. Okay.
How's that now?
That's good. I'm going to turn myself on.
Okay, thank you for saying something. I'm so sorry.
Thanks.
Okay, we will pay more attention. We were just talking about designation.
At HCJ's got it on our building now. It has mentoring.
I believe that's Dr. Green. Dr. Green, that was you, right?
I know Rob Sanderson doesn't know it.
Yep. Okay. It's there, but it's not a clear process. So a lot of times, as mentioned, if it does come up, it's left up to staff interpretation. That makes me feel very uncomfortable. Because we look at it, when it goes through a staff, like an administrative review, when we're looking at it through the lens of which we have the expertise to review. So sometimes that leads to whereas building would say, yes, this is fine, it's up to code. Historic preservation would be like, oh, well, no, because you're taking away the integrity of your building and why it was a local landmark in the first place. And then we don't have any way to proceed because we have two different looks at it. It's a very uncomfortable place to be in as a city staff person. So that's something that we need to look at. So if they are going to play it by the same rule, and that's something that we need to examine. Do we want to have kind of a designation of I don't want to say a rah-rah property, but that seems like that's not. But do we want like a feel-good plaque to identify and designate without putting restrictive measures on the property?
Like the golden hammer that HCJ gives out.
Yeah, it's acknowledgement of you did a good job historic preservation wise, but you maybe don't want to participate in the design guideline kind of stringent process.
So I think it'd make a difference too for people who apply for it. If they know it up front,
Right.
They may not be applying for it.
Okay. And it's, and that is something that I've tried to make because I've read it and I've looked at the code and I'm like, well, wait a minute. This is not something that we are doing currently. And it does, like I said, it does not really come up all that often. Because generally if somebody is interested in historic preservation, they're interested in it personally, and there's not usually a whole lot of conflict. But if ownership of the property changes hands,
We have a problem.
sure, absolutely.
That's one of the questions I've always had, that if you just, the example was that if ownership of the property change and the new owners decide they don't want to participate in that, where are they in now the process? Are they locked in?
It depends. So if they're in a district, it would be really hard to get out of that unless you got the rest of the district. But that brings up another excellent point. There should always be an appeal and repeal process. So we don't currently have that, but if you wanted to undesignate yourself as a local historic district, there should be a process for that. Or if you want to undesignate yourself as a local landmark, there should be a process for that. There should always be, everything should be permanent, but also reversible, because that's not oxymoron, but
That's one of the important things about having that, because it's not even in the minimum GIS. Something is a landmark award or it falls into
Right.
anything, and there's no parameters there. That's one of the things that with the digitizing and with all the history that's going in.
and we're working on that. So we are, as a side note, working on GIS layers to have all of our historic properties to be able to click and find out information about them. We're somewhat partnering. We're moving into the realm of partnership with HCJ so they can put the photos and the articles and whatnot online. That way people can have a better understanding of the historic properties within the city.
We're going to sell something. We like as
Yeah.
realtors,
Right.
they can know.
So I should also note, certificate of appropriateness. There's a couple of ways that communities utilize a certificate of appropriateness tool. They either don't, and they do overlay districts and they route everything through their planning and zoning commission. Or they do, and they send every single case before the Historic Preservation Commission, and then the Historic Preservation issues a certificate of appropriateness, and the work that you are proposing is appropriate for your structure or landscape or whatever it may be. There's also, communities also, I think, use it in a third way in which they only review cases that do not, so there's a staff level administrative review. So if somebody with a historic property comes in and they have plans for their structure and it falls within the design guidelines, it stays at the staff level and they're issued their permit. If they want granted an exception or they fall into a gray area, that is when they would go through the Historic Preservation Commission for review of their project. And then if it's approved, they would get issued a certificate of appropriateness and could move on to get their building permit or whatever it may be. So there's that phrase gets thrown around a lot. And I just want to make sure that you know what it means and also that it can mean different things to different communities.
But we don't have that now.
We do not have that now.
The other thing that Donna and I butted heads about a year ago.
That's gonna happen.
I was proposing to build a structure at the corner of Lafayette and Carter Street. Now, I believe that's Old Town. And so, and I was trying to do something that was cognizant of Lafayette Street, since there's nothing there. And so one of the things that we were kind of butting heads about was that the type of structure that I wanted to put there. And so now, where in these guidelines, and I've always been a proponent of old and new and kind of meld together. Am I premature in asking this question? Where would I go to find instruction on my new building?
So that would be, so one of the things that we would want to do, so we get our code taken care of, we get it cleaned up as much as we can, because you know that we'll get something adopted and then there'll be a gray area happen. You always go back and fix components. What you do then is you get your code cleaned up and then you go after design guidelines, but in a different look. So there's design guidelines that are codified that you are required to keep per district, but each district may have different characters and different architectural styles that they'll have different components to. But what it's good to, I'm just gonna pull up an example. You pull up Denver's. Out there. So what a lot of cities and communities do is they adopt design guidelines as something as a whole. Like, this is how you do and build construction. This is how you demo. This is how you do appropriate additions. This is how you do accessory dwelling units. This is how, but they'll lay it out so that way you know the concept of what is looking for. There's nothing wrong with building something new in a historic district. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But it's how those rules get interpreted.
Bill, over where we were running into the situation it was already set up as a historic district there for School Street and that area of Lafayette. And there were already parameters. You couldn't spend over a certain amount of money on any property in that because of the floodplain. And
Well,
I mean, there's 11 different things there.
I think where the misconception came in was that I'm across the street from the historic School Street district. And I was proposing this particular facade and everybody was up in arms and, and what do you mean? And so when I would show them the design, my concept was I wanted something that was stately. It showed that we're going to be here for a long time, kind of a facade. And so there was some back and forth about that. And so the developer and I just kind of put everything on hold until, well, here we are today.
Well, but that's what, you know, and that's why we're here, is because you run into, when stuff is, when code is left up to interpretation, you run into conflict naturally, because then everybody's going off of what they read. Yes, yes, absolutely. So this is, let's see if I can, this is what Denver put out recently, and I fancy it. So what they have is they have like an overarching, you know, these are the design guidelines. So you have guidelines for preserving historic buildings, and they tell you about roofs and foundations and additions. But they also tell you, like, here's how you do additions to historic buildings. Here's how you do new buildings or non-contributing buildings. Landscape, signage. They really hit on all of it. So basically they give like an over, and then at the end, these are the individual neighborhoods. So these are their local historic districts that they have. So they cover the concept overall, and then in the appendices, they actually have the individual design guidelines of each neighborhood. So because each neighborhood should be treated differently, and how they're approached. But they talk about, and this would be something that we would flow into utilizing a historic preservation fund grant to say, okay, we've cleaned up our code, we have clear processes. Now, instead of people having to go and read the code, let's create a separate document that reads a little bit better with pictures as examples of what we're talking about that references the code. That way it's more of a tool that is able to be utilized. Yeah, a how-to. So they have this how-to, you know, they talk about the historic background, benefits, building code, zoning code. They bring it all together in this one document. So if somebody knows that they're entering into it, they have an older building, they can go and just get this document and review it and be more comfortable, because the last thing that we want is somebody to be in their construction project and then we have to go in and pull it. That's not good for anybody. It's not good for us. It's not good for the person that's developing. We don't want to, we want all the smooth processes. And also like an educational tool for people that are wanting to do like straight up preservation and utilize tax credits. That's a complicated process as well. And we don't really have anything out there that provides a guide for people that are interested in doing that. So there's that. Let me pull up in one of the neighborhoods so you can see what they've done here. So currently our design guidelines are just a bunch of words saying you need to have this setback and you need to have this roof height. Pictures speak 1,000 words. So it would be nice to be able to do something like this. Like here is their Wyman Historic District. They talk about what they're wanting within their historic district. What's the porch width, height, shapes. These are design guidelines that come with a little bit of explanation. So this looks like it's a commercial. So they have commercial, industrial, and it looks like a little bit of residential. But they talk about what they're wanting exactly, and then they give you photos of the existing district. So these are the design guidelines for that specific district. But it kind of gives you an overall idea of what I mean when we're talking about these different styles and design guidelines, because they again, like certificate of appropriateness, depending on the context that you're mentioning it in, could be completely different. So design guidelines for a local historic district are specific to that district, but design guidelines for as a tool would be kind of an all-encompassing document that gives you a how-to when you're going down this road. Okay.
I just have one more question. Then
Sure.
I'll be quiet. Now, this is I'm assuming the problem that the city is running into with the Capitol Avenue after the tornado. You've got certain buildings that were just totally demolished and removed. And so now you've got historic building, vacant lot, historic building.
Right.
Okay, so now without knowing what the new owner or the architect come in with, is this a hindrance to development?
It can be if you don't utilize the tool right. So we're gonna go back. Let me get out of here. How'd you get out of here? You go. Ah. What browser? Okay. Let's go back. So they talk about new construction. It's a big document, so it's having a hard time driving. Let's see what page it's on and jump there. And I think where we get into trouble in this community, and this is my personal opinion, is that when we think that there's structures in a historic district that we can't do new. What that does is 100 years from now, you're not gonna have an architectural style in your city because you hindered new styles. You've also hindered your neighborhood, because you're not allowing people change their use. You know, it used to be, a lot of older properties, there used to be rooms for everything, and then there was open floor plans, and now it's kind of like maybe shifting a little bit from that. So depending on how we use things, houses want offices now because we're all working from home. Like the way we function as human beings dictates how we live. So if we don't allow that, then nobody's gonna wanna live there. Got to have a bit, let's see here. Where's my new construction? Oh, it's in here. I've looked at it. There you go. 71. Points for new buildings. We still for here. Actually, 70. Oh, we're on 65. We'll get there. Hang in, folks. We'll get there. Okay. So they have this whole concept. What is new? It could be a new porch. It could be a new structure. It could be a new accessory dwelling unit. It should be like a garage or a shed or. It also, in your Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties, they also address new construction. It's not like you can't do anything. In fact, it's like opposite. It's like encouraging that they want to keep that neighborhood going because vacant lots are never good for anybody.
Put this booklet together, by the way.
That would be, that's the National Park Service. It's beautiful, isn't it?
So
They started that. I know it's enacted in 66, but so 68 makes sense. So there's a new structure. Can you tell which one is new? Not really. They have like the fence lines all in a row, the setbacks are all in a row. So it was compatible with the neighborhood, but still new. I've also seen it when it's like brand new, crazy, like here, there's a modern building next to an older one. They keep some of the ornamental designs of the architecture that's next door, but they've got some modern elements in it. It works. You may not be your personal taste, but it works for the overall look of the building. So there's ways to do that. And I think we are maybe preventing that from happening, either intentionally or unintentionally. I don't know. From my perspective, it's an unintentional process. So the next one, gotta go back to. Okay. Okay, all these things. I love technology, but sometimes I hate it. Okay, so the next one we're looking at is page 97. Okay, this is where all my shine. Establish a tiered structure, neighborhood conservation overlay districts, regulations, guidelines, customized to the character of the neighborhood goals for the district's protection at level, significance, and integrity of its historic buildings and streetscape. Did anybody take a good look at this? Not to put you all on the spot. I never did my historical class either. But did anybody read this really well?
Right over it.
What'd you think
What?
about this,
What I think.
about this section?
This is gonna be the hardest one that
Mhm.
I come up with.
Yeah.
For.
Yeah.
So what it's basically saying, suggestion, and I did learn that this was staff led at the time. What it's saying is that there should be a tiered structure of how you do historic districts based off of how historic something is. Uh,
Could you explain what overlay district means before we go on into this
Yes.
discussion?
So, and this is probably, I muted you, unfortunately. So we have two types of, well, actually three, but we utilize two. We have two types of of doing a local historic district in effect. We have the conservation overlay districts and we have local historic districts. At the end of the day, they're both the same thing. They're restricted by design guidelines. They mean the same thing for property owners, but they go through a different process. So in overlay districts, the process is that it becomes, it's a land use issue. So it goes through the Planning and Zoning Commission. It gets designated as an overlay district within the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I believe that's where that's its designation. I don't even think it goes to council at that point. I have to double check that. I might be misspeaking, but I think that's what it is. A local historic district. So our overlay districts we have with the Lower Jefferson Conservation District, and we have the overlay district on East Capitol. They're both zoning mechanisms that establish them. A local historic district, which we have one in School Street, is designated, its process goes through the Historic Preservation Commission and then is officially designated by ordinance at council. But at the end of the day, it's the same result. So that's where in this, that's something that we have to look at. Do we want to keep a tiered system or do we just want one? And if we want a tiered system, how many tiers do we put in? Because so what is recommended in this section of the historic preservation plan is that there's almost, I counted 4. So there's local historic districts, which is the highest level, that has to conform to design guidelines. And a level 1 neighborhood conservation overlay district, which is a high level commercial centers. And then there's level 2 neighborhood conservation overlay, which is a medium level. And then there's also base zoning, meaning that anything that is within Old Town has a base zoning requirement, eliminating the need for specific sub areas to be designated as overlay districts. What I read, well, I mean, what do you guys think about that before I give my opinion?
Well, I've heard you refer to the School Street District. How do you handle the foot district?
We don't, so we only handle what's the local historic district. So what's within the boundaries of that School Street Historic District? Even if it's a property that could fit in with that historic district, if it's not formally adopted, it's not treated the same.
And so what is the foot district classified as?
Nothing. There's no designation for it.
Nobody's ever applied for designation. But back to your question. And you're asking about these four.
What do you guys think about that type of process?
I still have a hard time understanding the difference between a conservation district and the overlay. You know, and how, other than overlay has gone through ordinance, conservation, or through zoning, and I don't think the conservation has as such.
Right. It's all,
It's just a designation of this is like an area that kind of fits together, but it has never gone to a zoning. It's never had any specific parameters where the overlay actually has parameters.
and our current, so there's different, we have kind of levels of local historic districts currently requires 75% of the property owners to sign off on it. Conservation district requires 50. But they're both exist by the same rules.
Did that change?
No,
Because, okay, when I did the Lower Jefferson Conservation District, at that time, the structure was advisory district, conservation district, and historic district. And for the historic district, you had to have 75%.
Yeah.
Of the neighbors to notarize signatures on, to agree to the guidelines. The conservation district was 65%. And the advisory district, I'm not sure what it was because I didn't want to mess with that. I was striving for historic district. We were facing some demolition and new construction on West Main Street by an August deadline going to city council. So I was able to secure 70% instead of the 75. So I had to run with a conservation district. It did go through Historic Preservation Commission, Planning and Zoning Commission committee and city council. So it is a district by ordinance. But then when there was a change in all the levels, I believe Kathy Fordner was instrumental in getting the Lower Jefferson Conservation District kind of grandfathered in to be an overlay district. So I think it would be a little bit stronger and be on staff's radar to inspect and do the permit process and all of that. So I don't know when it changed. The conservation district is just 50. To me, conservation districts can kind of be thrown out, just like advisory districts were, and stick to just.
so at the end of the day, what is the difference
They're,
between lower?
I know.
Right.
Well, that was what I had to work with as far as the ordinance at the time. That was the structure. And I was just, my focus was to get some type of protection for the neighborhood. And we had the director of it, Chippo, do our guidelines because fortunately he lived in the neighborhood. So they're all written from this historic preservation standpoint. So it really is a historic district by nature of the neighborhood and the guidelines. But we had to be called a conservation district because we didn't have 75%. We had 70. And we only needed 65, but I didn't have time to, because a lot of the owners lived out of town elsewhere. So we were like on the road driving in notary. That's another thing. The whole notary thing is a big hurdle too.
So, yeah, that's why we're talking about designation. So in the plan. And I did kind of talk to, so a lot of the staff that worked on the plan are no longer here. I did kind of talk to Eric Barron to kind of, who's our head planner, and said, what's going on with this? And the conversations at the time were about allowing a staff level review versus having to go through citizen bodies and up to the council. So when there's not for the designation, But once it's already designated, how do you handle the work that goes with a historic district? Can staff review something and allow it as long as it fits within the design guidelines? Currently, it's a limbo status. It's one of those things where we get left up to interpretation. Again, I'm comfortable, because, you know, before a building, if something is in a local historic district or a local landmark, before any construction activities are supposed to happen, if they come in and for a building permit, we're supposed to review it in front of the Historic Preservation Commission. That's what the code says, review. Okay, what if we don't like it? What if we like it? What if, you know, what's the Historic Preservation Commission supposed to do within that review? What's its role? What are its powers? You know, what, because then if the Historic Preservation Commission decides that we don't think you should be issued a building permit, then what? You know, then you end up in that uncomfortable limbo status. And I'll tell you, in the past, it was never even going before the Historic Preservation Commission. It was just getting issued a building permit. So then it's, well, why are we having your design guidelines in the first place if we're not going to be utilizing?
I'm glad Councilwoman. I was just told something that was very devastating to me. So there is no designation for a Lafayette Street historic foot district.
No.
Okay, why did they allow that to go through? This went through protective services. This went through the city. Councilwoman Ward was there the day we dedicated the plaque. City council was there
I don't know what.
commemorating.
Did you get a guideline, but did you get a landmark or?
What happened was, the explanation that I was given personally was that the city code was in such disarray that they didn't have everything in place to go through that formal process. And so they allowed, plaque is there now. They're using it in their literature. Everything that was designated as the Lafayette Street and the historic foot district was allowed to go.
Okay.
And so now you're telling me that there is no such thing as a historic district. I'm appalled.
That's correct.
All they did was, when they were trying to set up community park and that whole greenway area, they applied for a historic sign designating the foot just as
That
a
is not
historic
what
sign.
happened. That is
But
not
that's-
what happened. And I can't let that go through under that facade, because that is not what happened. And so and Dr. Green,
Still there.
can she hear me?
Yes, I was on mute.
You were a guest speaker at that commemoration ceremony that day.
Yes, I was.
And so I'm appalled.
Dr. Green, were you under the impression that it was going to become a local historic district?
I wasn't involved in those activities, but I was at the designation. They put up the sign, and the sign does say historic landmark, and it says Lafayette Street. I can't remember what the sign says, but
Says Lafayette Street and the
the
historic foot
group
district.
have been working on that for a number of years before it happened. So you can ask Mr. Brown how long they worked on it, but it was several years. So to say that now, what is a Lafayette district? I mean, what are the boundaries of the Lafayette district?
Well, as far as like it's not on the National Register. And it's not a local historic district. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not. And that's where if it was under the impression or let's put a pin in it.
So
and I'll look
what-
into it, because I don't know.
If
It was supposed to be a
no
local.
paperwork was filled, because I've done historic amendments to the Lincoln University Historic District on 2 different occasions. And you have to do all the paperwork, and it took me several months to a year to do both of those designations at 2 different times. So if there's no paperwork, unfortunately, I'll have to agree with you. There is no historic district. Because there should be physical boundaries to say this is the Lafayette Community District.
And it was designated Beltman to Elm, Lafayette, and all of this, and
So who was the principal writer? Do you remember?
we worked with protective planning. Who was the lady before Sunny?
Janice Miller.
There we go.
Well, here's what we could, because I want to get through in a timely manner, but what I'll do is I'm gonna look into it and see what kind of records we have to see if there was any type of, and it just didn't go through a formal process. Because, that could have been the intention and it just never made it. So if that's the case, that could be something, hopefully we can get this done first before that way we have a cleaned up process. But
Which is what we're trying to.
these are the
establish
kind of
with
things
that.
that we're trying to avoid, because I don't like that you come and you say that there was a foot historic district, and you're under the impression that there's a foot historic district, and I have to say, no, it's not there, it doesn't exist technically. So, yeah, I'll circle back on our staff time, and pull the records and figure out what was going on, what the intention there was, and then where it got left, and we'll see if we can get you.
What's written up, it says officials recognized a historic area in downtown Jefferson City with a dedication and ceremony and plaque. And then Lafayette Street, Jefferson City and surrounding area was within commercial district. It's called the Foot District, span from Dunklin to Elm Street. And then just tells the story of it, but they did not, apparently they didn't submit anything as a formal historic district.
Yeah.
What this article is saying.
No, I see I can see it, but I mean, that's where, again, it's a good example of why we need to go through some code revisions. Because we have a misunderstanding in the community, and you don't allow work to flow. There's misconceptions. I can tell you're very disappointed, and I don't like that, Glover, because we should, if you thought it was a local historic district, that's a problem. That's a problem. That is a problem with how they said that where they designated the streets on where it was. They called it a district. They commemorated it.
And the city council was there.
Yeah. So we'll have to circle back, but let me do some research.
Did you get all your questions answered about page 97B16, your discussion? On that?
Well, do you
So
guys?
basically, what the idea of the tiered level is to be able to have the ability for staff to be able to approve one area, and then the next tier would be to go to HPC.
I think
Is that what
I
the
think that
idea
was
behind
sort of
it?
the concept, but I don't know. I'll just lay out my opinion. I think it gets confusing and complicated, and then you start putting value of, what is more historic than something else? I don't want to do that. And I don't know that should be like where members of the community are like, well, I live in a more historic district than in your historic district. Like historic is historic, and there's different levels of historic. I mean, it's historic because of who lived there. It's historic because of the architecture. It's historic because, they're workforce housing, but they all were Sears kits, or, there's different levels, and there's one does not make it more significant than the other. I also think if you're gonna have these different levels of designation, what's the difference once they become? How do they get treated? Are they treated differently? It doesn't seem that way. And I don't think it should be that way.
My understanding was that they were different, and the levels of support were different. Restrictions were less. So in a lesser designated, you don't have to dot as many I's and cross as many T's. But when you get up to the higher level, there were more restrictions. Now, I agree with you. I think the idea of just having a local historic district without any levels, that makes a lot of sense. I think that
It
would be-
either is or it isn't, right?
That's a good way for the group to go.
Yeah, and you still, that's where, I did talk with our planner and I said, he was like, well, certificate of appropriateness doesn't allow staff level review. I'm like, well, it does, but that's where it comes into like either all of your things go in front of a decision body or only the things that don't, that don't fit those design guidelines. And that's something where we could put easy flow, because if you have appropriate design guidelines, staff can look at it, and if it makes sense to go ahead and move on with their project, there's no holdup, there's no waiting 30 days, there's no hearing, none of that. They could just go ahead and move on with their project. If they fall within a gray area, or they're wanting to do something that's an exception to the rule, that's what you have to come for. And that's where, like with the HPC, it starts becoming about like who gets the exceptions, who doesn't. We don't technically allow metal roofs, but they're putting in a good case for it, so maybe we allow that. That would be up to that body. That's not up to staff. So that would be where that rule would come in. So all on the tiered structure, all on the it is what it is. If it's historic, it's historic, and don't mess around it. That is what this body is here to decide. Do you want to do it that way? So like, just think about it, and you don't have to like, and this is where, I was telling Buddy this earlier, we're not going to take formal votes on levels of code into the end. Otherwise, we're going to have to go back and amend, because I want to allow you guys to change your mind. So if we find something and we think, yeah, that's the one, that looks perfect, and then we get into another section and we realize that we've looked at ourselves, we can just amend it within the body, within the text body. But if you feel like you're in disagreement and she wants to call like a consensus vote, like where does everybody stand on this? Sort of like jury duty, then you all can express yourselves and we can figure that out. If we get stuck, we can table something. We can bring in other people besides myself. But if you want to talk to Eric Barron, if you want to talk to our planner, if you want to talk to our building official, if you want to talk to code enforcement, we can bring those folks in. Legal, SHPO, they're in Jeff City, use them. We can do any of those things. But I just want you to feel like you have the options to express an opinion. And that's where, like, my personal opinion, I think that part of the historic preservation plan is well, like, I don't like it. But that's my personal opinion. The consultants at the time, that's what they feel they have to push out, and that's where it comes upon you all to figure out what you guys like.
But we're not deciding that today,
You don't have to. You don't have to,
or we could.
or you could. It's up to you. Let's get through this real quick because I feel like we're starting to time. And then the next section on page 148, develop historic neighborhood design guidelines to illustrate the appropriate treatment of historic residences that will be useful and informative for the owners of the historic homes throughout the city. I kind of had planned on unveiling the design guidelines at this point, but we took a peek at our Christmas present. But that's where, at the end of the day, when we have a finished product, that would be the next approach, is to give people a usable tool that they can reference and that they can look at, that they can move forward with their project, or even know that it's capable. I think a lot of times we run into issues where people don't develop on vacant lots in the city, and it's driving me crazy. We need some infill development for our neighborhoods, especially on the east side and the south side. There's just this misconception that because it's it's this older part of the town that we can't do any infill development. It's a great opportunity to develop right now, but I feel like we're inflicting restrictive measures on ourselves. Because we don't have that word out there. We haven't educated our community on what it means to be in kind of, not even a historic district, just an older area of town. Like, what can you still do there? So I would like to pursue a design guideline similar to what Denver had. And make it a reference so people can utilize it if they're doing new construction, addition, even demo. There needs to be a clear process on how people can manage their property within the city, historic or not. Um, All right, now I'm going to pull up, open the code that we've drafted. Where is it? Is it? I don't know. Is that the one we edited? Yeah, we edited it because it's got writing language all over it. Okay. So we started with designation because that's really like the first step. Did everybody get a chance to review the section of code? If you didn't, it's at the end of the packet. And I'll just kind of read through it. Everything kind of starts. Oh gosh. Can't see up close. I can't see the distance. Statement of purpose, the City of Jefferson Historic Preservation Commission, City Council, and any member of the public may identify potential local historic districts and local landmarks based upon the criteria identified in this article and the Secretary of Interior standards. Criteria for designation. So these are the components. So whenever a designation comes before the HBC or whatever body it comes before, what makes it a local historic district or a local landmark? So we've drafted the proposed historic district or local landmark shall possess significant character or value as it relates to the heritage or culture of the community, county, state, or nation. The location of the site and or landscape is significant to a local, county, state, or national event. The association with persons of significance to the community, county, state, or nation. The embodiment of a notable architectural style with associated distinguishing characteristics. The proposed landmark was produced by a significant architect or designer. The proposed local historic district and or local landmark contains natural or built design elements that make the structure or site unique. The proposed local historic district or local landmark has yielded or likely to have yielded information important to in history or prehistory. Is there anything that y'all don't like or anything that you feel like should be added? Hesitating. Dramatic pause. And questions purple. Procedure for designation. Let me tell you, this is where we got crazy in our little internal staff meeting. This is what we do. Because we started talking about processes. We're like, okay, how is this sucker supposed to flow? And then we got hung up. Which that happens to us too. Nomination of a local historic district or local landmark may be initiated by the City of Jefferson Historic Preservation Commission, City Council, or any member of the public by filing the appropriate application with the Department of Planning and Protective Services. And if you have a comment or a question,
I mean, anybody can do it. That's what it says, so.
pretty much. And that's really what, and this is a personal flavor of mine. I do not like to staff drive historic districts. Because then it becomes, the government is telling me what to do with my property. I like this local historic districts to be organic and flow. If the neighborhood comes up and wants to do it, or if somebody comes to the Historic Preservation Commission and the Historic Preservation Commission decides that they want to initiate that process, great. They're a citizen body. They have that right to do so. Also the council. But that is not going to be something that is city led. It has to be initiated for that staff person to act. Nomination requirements, applications and support material for the designation of local landmark or local historic district or local landmark. Applicant, contact information, signatures of all property owners of record. Property narrative, including historic name, year built or established in one or more of the criteria identified in section above A. So those, local historic district. Applicant contact information. Map showing the boundaries of the proposed district and name of proposed district. District narrative. including one or more of the criteria identified in that first section that we reviewed. Signatures from 75% of property owners within proposed district, notary seal included.
Sounds like that might be an issue.
Well, that's up to you all. Design guidelines for proposed district that reflect the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. So that's something that we're gonna push that on the applicant. That's gonna be, if you want your, and that's probably gonna be a back and forth process where they'll work with staff, we'll get their design guidelines, you know, using the right language and making sure it makes sense before it goes through, but there's gonna have to be skin in the game from the community, not being driven by staff. So 75% notary. What do you guys think about all of that? Do you like it? Do you not like it?
The only thing, we've got the procedure. I guess I'm looking for, as we discovered earlier, where do we say something in here specifically like landmark falls in the same criteria as far as having to have meet design guidelines or whatever? Because there's nothing there, and is that going to be the case in the future? Are landmark buildings going to have a design guideline or a procedure associated with having to do something with that property?
Well, what do you guys think about that? I mean, it currently, and how we drafted it, and we kind of did the same mistake twice. We didn't actually put design guidelines for local historic district or local landmarks. Should we? Or should we keep them separate?
I think just knowing how local landmarks have been treated in the past, they've been like our Golden Hammer Awards for the HCJ. It's designating someone who's taken a building, restored it, whatever, or has kept it in, appropriate condition, et cetera, as opposed to having any restrictions on doing something else to it.
What are we saying is a landmark that is contributing to the
Oh, yeah,
environment? I mean, it fits all the criteria of.
yeah, but I'm just looking at, how do,
Right.
we need to get the message out there for having some repercussions, if you will.
Sure.
Yeah.
The question is whether you're gonna lay all that stuff out in this section or you have a separate section.
That's what I'm
That's what,
asking.
so then it becomes, okay, we've done this, we've kind of done this injustice to landmark owners, right? So they don't realize that they're in this game, that they're in the game.
Mhm.
Now, flip, do you think the landmark owners expect their building to be preserved after their time?
I would say yes. Just knowing all the trouble that folks go to put it in and the trouble they go to to begin with.
So then it becomes, so then it's like from, I'm thinking local government, I always put things in these roles because it just helps me process. But is it appropriate for local government to issue a recognition of something without it having any process or role in the community? Whereas you've got kind of this double-edged sword. Property owner thinks that the city is going to preserve their structure forever and ever. Property owner doesn't know that they're restricted, but then there's no guidelines on how they're restricted. So we run into this, because we
Well, that's
haven't
what I'm
done landmark
asking, yeah.
awards so very long.
Well, that's the reason I'm asking, is there something, if this is the procedure for designation, does there need to be something written in the procedure, whether it's in the application itself that says, we must be aware that if you.
Or do we make them produce design guidelines as well?
So there just needs to be another section that here's the result of being, here's what it means. To be a local landmark or a local historic district. Spelling out what it means.
Okay. So is it okay to have the nominations as, like right now, where you have your section, you have to be your nomination requirements, and there's one, nomination of local landmark, two, local historic districts.
Well,
Is that the appropriate spot to separate them?
it could be just a line in here that says the other requirement is acknowledgement as a landmark designated property. I realize, you will conform to what the guideline is or something.
About definition, defining what it means. Then we need a section, we got criteria and procedure, then we need a definition.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that would help.
We do have,
They find it.
we're trying to get organized. Okay. This one? Yeah.
It certainly needs to be defined, whether you put it here or put it somewhere else. There has to be a definition spelled out.
So Article 1, when we sat down as staff to try to write this, first we came up with an outline. So we have the Article 1 in general, and that's where it talks about purpose, and then it has definitions there. But it was hard for us to write starting off because we didn't have any of the content. So we had to skip down, and also we have responsibilities and procedures, Article 2. Article 3, designation of local, that's where we started, because that's the first public process. But I think you're right, I think we should define what it is, what it means.
And even before we adopt this, have that definition written. So that we know, hey, this is a landmark, you're applying for this, it's a single building designation, and it must comply with, whether it's a specific guideline, or it must maintain, or it must go before HPC if changes are made to the building, or whatever, or it must adapt to whatever code is there. So it has to be in the definition itself.
So designated,
Yeah,
these are the results of that.
yeah.
So if it's okay, I'm gonna put defining a local landmark on the next agenda, since we're starting to run over on time. And that way it gives you guys an opportunity to stew on the idea of what to do with local landmarks.
And local historic district, I thought that would be fine. The only other thing I would suggest changing is the title of Article 3. You've got up at the top, designation of local historic districts. I would say local landmarks and resources.
Yes, we're having two separate things.
Do we want resources in there?
I don't know what
Well-
that refers to. What does that mean?
Because we haven't gone to that yet.
I'm not entirely sure either, so.
It's not offering any resources.
No, not so.
So I think there's sometimes there's local historic districts, there's local landmarks, archaeology, if there's an archaeology component, or if there's like say like down the line, your well, McClung Park is a Civil War. Nobody should develop here because it's got some archaeological content. That would be where I've seen resources used. Usually they identify them as cultural resources and identify that usually that means archaeology.
I think I put that somewhere else. I think I just put designation of local landmarks
Okay.
and
And
local
local historic districts.
That
And
was
skip the overlay
Well,
as being,
Put a pin in it,
you're proposing basically we no longer have overlay districts,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
what I'm
that's
saying.
another discussion for future meetings.
I would prefer to have one or the other. Either we do the overlay districts in the planning and zoning commission, or we do the local historic districts to the historic preservation commission. I think having multiple processes is confusing, and then at the end of the day, they end up for the same spots of how they're. We need to walk that through from, like let's pretend like a historic district has a life cycle. Like what's the beginning of it? How does it, it should also have the element of being eliminated too.
That's another section.
That's another section.
Well, the only thing I can use as an example is going back to Lafayette Street. When we worked with MoDOT's people.
Yeah.
And city, that was one of the things that we discussed in setting up the Lafayette Street Historic District, was that it was an archaeological historic site. And so I know these conversations were had with city, MoDOT, and even Lincoln University, because they were the principal property owner.
So with that one, that's a term of mitigation. So MoDOT was going to come through with the expressway. And they were digging up areas that had some archaeological significance, so they have to mitigate the loss of that cultural resource.
Right.
And I think in response, if they said that they were going to do a historic district.
No, they corrected me and told me that what I needed to do, and I think I brought that up at our last meeting, since there was no physical structure there on Lafayette Street, then how would you categorize that historic district? And I believe I brought up in the conversation that it would be an archaeological historic district. And so when we formed what we thought at the time was the Historic Lafayette and Flood District, that it was an archaeological historic site. And we've been predicating everything that we've been doing on that knowledge base. And I can't say I'm a little disturbed.
Sure. I don't blame you, to be honest. And like I said, we'll look into it. I'll figure out what we were supposed to do, if we were supposed to do something. Gonna go back through the files and see if we can find something.
Well,
I am driving blind because we used to, I'm like, what are you talking about? So let me do some homework. Ask around, dig up some files, and we'll see what we can find and see if we can get you unperturbed.
all right, well, I think proclamation later should be, but we'll go from there. Go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So what else do you need from,
Is there anything else that you have, any other suggestions that you have with this draft?
I mean, should we address the 75% of property owners within the proposed district? Notarized? Laura?
That's up to this committee. I just wanted to share my experience with having to, make that hurdle. It's extremely hard. I mean, it wasn't extremely hard to hit 70. And if you have time restrictions and not being able to locate the owners, so you're taking a notary all over the county. So, I don't know how else you would do it. I mean, unless you just allow just signatures and unnotarized signature.
I mean, that runs into all kinds of issues too. People fight whether it's a real signature.
I think it is a high threshold.
But if you're putting that much restriction on the area, it probably needs to be a high threshold for 75% to agree to it.
What do other districts and other cities, have you researched that at all? What their threshold is?
Sometimes they require everybody to sign on.
Oh, really?
Sometimes it's a 50%, 75%. Sometimes they don't leave it out there and they make a public hearing case where they allow people to come in, much like a zoning.
Like the overlay district.
Yeah.
That's-
Yeah, much like a zoning case, they say, well, we're looking at this, it would mean, and then there would be different triggers, like, okay, well, what's that process? Do we just have to send all the property owners letters? Do we have to advertise it in the local paper? Do we, so those are also, and those things should definitely be written down in code. So that's also something that I would like you all guys to think about. Like, if you don't do the 75% of property owners, then how do you do it? How do you want to do it? What's fair to both property owners and how's that process driven? So I'll also put that on the agenda next time. Was there anything else that you guys want to chew on and reapproach next time?
So it's my understanding you don't need to vote on what you're proposing tonight. This was just a discussion and showing, explaining what we are going to be working on in the near future and.
If you ever feel like you don't have consensus in the room and you want to call a consensus vote, you can do that, and that's not a vote of record. So the vote of record would be like you've adopted it as a stakeholder, yeah, and then, right. So you could just be like, let's take a vote and see how everybody feels. That says,
Okay. And so is there any other business to discuss? So the dates to remember, our next meeting is the Thursday prior to Labor Day weekend. Does anybody have any concerns about being able to attend or?
I'll definitely be out of town, but, you know, if everybody else is,
Anybody else?
I'll be in Denver as a matter of fact. We'll have to look up the-
Yeah, bring the code back.
I'll print you out a copy and you can just run around the neighborhoods.
Take some pictures. I mean,
It's up to you all. If you guys want to meet at a different time.
I mean,
I got it on my calendar.
We just, at the beginning, you just have to sort of set a calendar. Otherwise, it just gets wild,
I'll
but,
try to do it by WebEx.
well, I mean.
yeah, it's all right, you're entitled to it. All right, well, it sounds like in the next meeting, is the September 2nd. And I assume Carly will send us an agenda and some information for us to review prior. That was very helpful. Thank you, Carly. If nobody has anything else, I call for a motion to adjourn. Got it. Second, all in favor? Say that motion. Thank you all for being here.
Yes. Thank you. Overall, enjoyed that. That was news to me Thursday. That's why
See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keep that money.